in the beginning until we gradually get better. And I think we have 4 words to prepare. That's a lot. Not the way to prepare.
Is that her van out there?
No.
Oh, it's just a random
That
van?
one is not. Nope, that's not.
Okay. I'll call the meeting to order. We'll start with roll call. Trustee Jacobs,
Present.
Trustee Chavez,
Present.
and Trustee Griffin is here, and Trustee Land and Trustee Andrade Zuniga. Yeah, I haven't done this for a while, or not. Tonight we have a team from Hannah interpreting as our Spanish interpreters. For those who would like to attend the meeting virtually in Spanish, that option is available. Hannah interpreting, would you please communicate that for us this evening?
Absolutely. Good afternoon and welcome to this session. In order to provide language access, this meeting will have simultaneous bidirectional interpretation into Spanish and American Sign Language. If you're bilingual, you don't have to click anything. But if you're not bilingual and you're using your laptop, in a few seconds, you'll see an icon shaped like a globe at the bottom of your screen. Click on Language Interpretation and then select English. If you're using your phone or an iPad, then locate the 3-dot menu in one of the corners of your screen. Click on Language Interpretation and then select English. When you speak, do so at a moderate pace because the interpreters are going to be simultaneously interpreting everything you say. A efecto de proporcionar acceso lingüístico, esta reunión contará con interpretación simultánea bidireccional al español y al lenguaje de señas americano. Si usted es bilingüe, no tiene que presionar nada, pero si usted no es bilingüe y está en su computadora, en unos segundos verá un icono en forma de globo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Haga clic en Interpretación de idiomas y después seleccione Español o Spanish. Si está en su iPad o su teléfono, entonces busca el menú de 3 puntos o que dice More en una de las esquinas de su pantalla. Haga clic en Interpretación de idiomas y después seleccione Español o Spanish. Gracias. Thank you.
Okay. If you wish to view the closed captions of this meeting, please view the meeting on the SMUHSD board meeting YouTube channel. The link to the YouTube channel can be found on our website. Viewers may request additional accommodations by calling 650-558-2201. That's 650-558-2201. For our deaf and hard of hearing community, we have a team from Hannah Interpreting Services, and they will be interpreting our meeting this evening. We would like to ask everyone to speak as clear and reasonable pace for our interpreters. Thank you. And let the minutes note that President Land is in attendance. And I'm actually going to take this opportunity to now that I've done all the reading, we're here. I'll keep talking here. Now that I've done all the reading, we're here for a budget study session, and I'll turn it over to Superintendent Booker.
You'll give me the chair back?
Absolutely.
All right, cool.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone being here today, the board and district staff. A lot of work went into today's general fund budget study session. Just a little background. We do this study session annually, typically though in the late spring. And last year we talked about moving this study session up into the late fall in order to provide the board, district staff, community with more opportunity to provide input and more opportunity for district staff to react to that input and develop the budget as per our budget cycle. So with that, I'd like to hand this over to Assistant Superintendent of Business Services, Yancey Hawkins, who's going to lead us with his team throughout the presentation. And again, I want to thank Ms. Miller, Ms. Castano, the rest of the team. I know a ton of work went into this, so I'm really, really appreciative. So with that, Yancey, it's all yours.
All right. All right. Thank you. I echo your thanks, Valerie Miller, Vanessa Castano. As Trustee Griffin noted, the folks who are really keeping our books balanced there. So I appreciate that. That is very true. And also a big special thanks to Christina Tang, who without this presentation would not be nearly as good as it is tonight. As Superintendent Booker noted, this is a focus of tonight is on the general fund of the district. We're going to focus on the numbers are from the budget are from the adopted budget from June. And the unaudited, the fund balance numbers are from the unaudited actuals that were approved by the board in September. So these will not have updated numbers since the budget adoption. Those will be included in the first interim presentation in December. But obviously there have been some changes, including actual enrollment, actual staffing and placements, et cetera, since then. So this afternoon, we'll go over key takeaways, look at the overall budget, and then focus on the different portions, including revenues and expenditures. We'll hit on the fund balance and our fund balance policy, look at our multi-year projections and the assumptions that we use in those multi-year projections. We'll take some time to answer questions, and then we'll get into a discussion of the step down of one-time expenditures, really focusing on the state and federal COVID funds that the district had received over the last several years. And then we'll end with questions and feedback. So if you don't take away anything else from the presentation, I want to really focus on a couple of key takeaways and really just a real focus that I ask the board to look at when monitoring the district's financial position. So the first is in terms of understanding, it would be the importance of secured property taxes and the growth of our assessed value in those secured property taxes as really the primary driver of additional funds that the board can make decisions on. And then the other three, we are in a people business. And so the three factors that really drive what our salary and benefit costs are going to be. The first is staffing formulas, ratios, and headcount. The second being collective bargaining with our labor partners. And the third being our enrollment projections and how many students that we are projected to serve. The last one, and I didn't put it in here, and I think we sometimes take it for granted, but is our fund balance. And so really monitoring what our fund balance is and ensuring that, we have enough fund balance to keep us from having to make quick decisions and without potentially enough information. In terms of key takeaways around affirming, tonight we'll look at the one-time funding and step down plan, and I really want to affirm some of the next steps there. In terms of other takeaways, other things that really impact the budget, our pension obligations, including our PERS and STIRS, looking at the impacts of those and what they're going to be doing in the future. Special education is about 20% of our budget, so always really monitoring those costs, utilities, and the state budget and what impact that has in terms of ongoing and one-time funding. So as I noted earlier, we're about a $220 million general fund budget. Of that, about 200 million, just under 200 million comes from LCFF sources, and we'll get into that as we break down those a little bit more. I noted we're in the people business, and this is the $220 million expenditure budget. A little bit, 82% of that is spent on salaries and benefits of our employees. So a vast majority of our budget is spent on people supporting our students and community. This slide has a breakdown of our unrestricted and restricted budget, and including our total budget of around 220 million. As the CBO, and what I ask the board to do is really focus on the unrestricted side of the budget. That's really our ongoing expenditures, as well as the impact of the restricted side of the budget on the unrestricted side. And then really with a focus on that ending fund balance on the unrestricted side, because that's truly the district's, that's what's there to support the district in bad times if needed. LCFF sources account for about 90% of the revenue for the school district. About 89% of that is secured roll taxes. And secured roll taxes, and I'll get into all of the different pieces of this, but the secured roll taxes is a portion of that 1% that folks pay, that you all pay, that Facebook pays for their property. So everyone pays 1% by Prop 13. That's broken up into different sections, and we receive a portion of that. That for us is about a little over 175 million, or about 90% of our LCFF sources. The other parts of LCFF sources, noting the secured taxes, unsecured taxes are business property. The easiest way to think about that is planes at SFO. So those are business property and they are taxed as well. And we get a portion of that. All other public agencies do as well. Redevelopment agency and property tax transfers. So redevelopment agencies are a funding mechanism for municipalities to support projects that limit blight or used to limit blight in a community. They have since been eliminated in the state of California, but those are winding down statewide. And some of that transfer flows in as a transfer unrestricted. And some of those funds are restricted to facilities and are transferred to Fund 21. And they are restricted by agreement of those RDAs and the school district. State aid, all districts in the state of California are entitled to at least $120 per ADA in state aid. It's in the Constitution. Our state aid amount is set at the 2012 level and will be held harmless at that level in law moving forward. And the educational protection account funds relate to Proposition 30, which, if you remember, that was that increase in taxes on high earners in the highest tax bracket back, 10 years ago plus, that were reauthorized through Proposition 55. And that equals about $200 per ADA in funding. The last is transfers to charter tax in charter schools in lieu of property taxes. These are the property tax transfer that we do to DTEC for our students that are enrolled. So that actually acts as a negative revenue source in our LCFF sources. So it offsets some of our revenue.
Sorry, is that in some of the budgets we can point out in this slide deck or no?
Yeah, it's right there. It's about
Okay.
$3.6 million transfer. So we have a roughly 300 students there, and it's about $12,000 per student that we transfer over to DTEC. This is mixed with the 300 students from Sequoia that also do a very similar transfer.
And we still have that arrangement, right?
We still have that arrangement where we do approximately half of the students are coming from San Mateo and half the students come from Sequoia.
And we get the income from Sequoia because we have an MOU agreement, right?
Yeah, that the amount flows through us to them. Correct. So what is the LCFF? The LCFF actually is the local control funding formula. It is the successor to the old revenue limit, if you guys remember the old revenue limit. And what it is essentially a guarantee. It's a guarantee that the state gives for every school district in terms of funding. And how the LCFF works, that's a little bit different than the revenue limit, is similarly to the revenue limit, there's a per student funding amount. That's that per student base amount. It's a little bit different by grade span, but it's a per student amount. Then what's different about it is the LCFF is a weighted student formula. And so what the LCFF does is notes that some students require additional supports. Some students should be, more expensive to serve because of their needs. So it adjusts for three different groups of demographic. First is our socioeconomically disadvantaged students. Second is our English learner population. And then the third, although much smaller as a number, is our foster youth. We multiply that times the average daily attendance in the school district, and you get the state guarantee. So that's not what the state is going to give you. It's what the state is guaranteeing that you will get as a school district. So for San Mateo Union High School District, that guarantee is right around $115 million. Now, how is that funded? So it's not a check from the state for $115 million. It's funded with two sources. It's funded first with property taxes. So our portion of that 1%, along with those other forms of taxes that I noted. And then the remainder is given to you through state aid. So given that we have $115 million guarantee, if our property taxes were $65 million, the state would write us a $50 million check. If our property taxes were only $20 million, the state would write us a $95 million check. I know you're saying, well, wait a minute, Yancey, I thought you said we had $175 million in secured taxes. Well, that's where basic aid or community funded districts happen. If your taxes are in excess of that state guarantee, so in our case, our taxes are above the $115 million state guarantee, the school districts are allowed to keep the additional revenue. So in that case, or in our case, we receive a little over $70 million above that state guarantee. That's how far we are community funded.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
So, because I know how LCFF works with LCFF funded districts,
Mhm.
because they have, like you said, the funding formula.
Yeah.
So they don't really receive any extra categorical. It used to be categorical funds, right? And now is it supplementary, they call it?
Yeah. So they rolled all of the old categoricals,
Into
which
just a
they had
formula.
made unrestricted, into the LCFF.
Okay.
But within that, now they have, it's not a categorical because it all gets
Right.
put into
It's all
your
general fund.
unrestricted, but you are required to use a certain amount of those funds. And that's when Dr. Kemke comes and notes with the LCAP, what we're doing with the amount of funds that would be driven by our socioeconomically disadvantaged students, our English learners, and our foster youth. So it's a little bit different than the old categorical system.
No,
but-
I know.
yeah.
And what I'm trying to get at is, so with the 115 million that we're supposed to be guaranteed,
Yeah.
there's a percentage based
Correct.
on the funding model of low income, et cetera, et cetera. Are those the limits that we use, those funding limits for what we need to put into our budget for English learners, or is it the 100 and plus 70, the 115 plus the 70 million? Is that formula then how much percentage we need to use for English learners, foster youth? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So it's based on the 115 of what our requirement is. But as our LCAP notes, we spend well over the requirements of the state. And we have before, even before the state required that through the LCAP and the LCFF funding.
Okay.
That's a great question.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I needed. Thanks.
Yancy, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Sometimes you hear things for years and then it's a little questionable in your mind. So folks say sometimes, are you basic aid funded or LCFF? So you made it really clear. So thank you for the slides so far. Actually, I looked at them all earlier, but so far what we've seen tonight. So we would have had $115 million had we gone with the state funding, but because our guarantee, that would have been the guaranteed, but because we have $166 million from the property taxes. Of course, we take the higher because who wouldn't, right? And we're supposed to. So I always thought it was, well, I've always been told is you're either LCFF funded or you're a basic aid district. But looking through your slides here, it looks like we're not necessarily a hybrid, but all the slides are mentioning like our sources of LCFF. So can you?
Yeah, so no, that's a good question. So all property tax and state aid around the LCFF, whether you're below, property taxes are below or above, are considered LCFF sources in the state's mind, because they're using that to compare to that LCFF guarantee. But it's really, I mean, it's a misnomer. It's not a great way to explain it for a community funded district. But there's only 10 or 15% of us that are community funded, and so for LCFF funded districts, it makes a ton of sense because your LCFF funding really is your LCFF guarantee.
I just want to say that I understood your question because I
Thank
had the
you.
same question.
Yes.
But if you look
Thank
at
you.
this slide, it kind of
Yes.
explains it.
He's
He's saying it's still LCFF because
Right.
we're funding sources are all different, but this is the LCFF community funded, which is what we are, which is the old basic aid
Okay,
philosophy.
yeah, I got it.
So
No,
we're
no.
still
Right.
considered basic
Right.
aid old school, but
Old school.
this is the model that we
Basic.
have.
Well, how many times have we been in a room where they say, welcome trustees, raise your hand if you're basic aid funded. Okay,
Right.
raise your hand if you're LCFF funded. So
Right.
you're in those situations, we seem to be either
Right.
or, but then,
So the term we are
Yes.
is we are
Yes.
LCFF
Community
community funded or
funded.
basic aid
yes,
district.
thank you.
Yeah, and basic aid actually comes from that $120 per ADA that I noted, that districts were used to be guaranteed at least a guarantee of, even with the funding above the LCFF level, they also were entitled to $120 per ADA. So that's where it comes from. It's not the best term either in terms of explaining what it is.
Before you move on, can I just ask, what is
Yeah.
our per pupil? So a lot of times we do a little comparisons, districts compare.
Mhm.
So Burlingame has a ADA of, funded per student is 7,800, whatever, because they're LCFF. How much are we funded, community funded? How much are we funded per pupil? Based
On an
this-
LCFF basis or
on this model,
overall?
on the community funded model, what are we per pupil? Is it
On a
10
per pupil, I'd have to go back at it, but it's a little over 20,000
So 20,000 per student.
per student. Yes. Yeah, it's a little over that.
Well, would
Good.
it be on page 5 where you take the total revenue of 220 million and then you divide that by the enrollment?
Yes and no. Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on if you're looking at ADA or if you're only looking at LCFF sources.
Right.
So, but it's a little over if you're looking at
You-
apples to apples versus an
You gave me the
LCFF.
apple to apples.
Yeah,
and I
it's
appreciate that.
a little over $20,000. per student.
Sorry, before we move on, while we're asking questions, can you remind me what is restricted versus unrestricted?
That's a great question, actually. So unrestricted are really dollars that we can spend, that the board can spend on any board priority. So science or math or special education,
Pencils.
pencils, thank you.
Yeah.
The electricity bill, buses. I mean, the water bill.
There you go.
PG&E.
Restricted are funds that we've received that are restricted in use.
Got it.
And I'm about to get into what a bunch of those are. But they may be, focused on low income students. They may be focused on transportation. They may be, focused on any number of different things. We also have a lot of locally identified. So our foundations usually aren't just giving us a check and saying, do whatever you want with it.
Yeah.
They're saying we want it spent for science or math or counseling or,
Got it. Okay.
the Yonder program, whatever it is.
And when we talk about general fund, does that include both of those? Or-
It includes both of those. Yes. So our general fund is the sum total of our unrestricted and restricted balance. And when I note what the impact of the restricted fund is, or the restricted portion of the general fund on the unrestricted, that's the contribution down like near the bottom of the page. It says contribution.
Yeah.
That's the impact of the restricted funds. So basically the restricted funds need that much money in order to be funded. And that's primarily two things. Number one, our special education is actually run out of the restricted side of the budget
Mhm.
because of the funding from the state and federal government that is restricted in use. as well as the 3% requirement for routine restricted maintenance. And those are the two biggest programs on the restricted side. And the contribution down below is really the contribution to those two programs.
Okay. And then one more question.
Yeah.
When you're talking about ADA,
Uh-huh.
what is that?
So ADA is our average daily attendance. So we're not, the guarantee is not based on enrollment, although there's a lot of pressure to do so at times at the state level. It's actually based on butts and seats, as they call it. So our ADA percentage is around 96%. So yeah, which is pretty good for the state.
Bob,
There was an interesting article in Oregon's column today that Burlingame has $17,000 a student. If it's printed, it says the source is the
no,
and then Hillsborough has $30,000.
I would question those figures because we are probably a little bit better off than Hillsborough is, but that's per student. I don't know.
Okay, it says the most recent provided by the State Department of Education website.
So just to be
Take it up with John
hey,
Horgan.
no, I'm gonna because and Yancey can help me with this a little bit because just what he was talking about before is he was saying, well, it depends on which numbers we're applying to. And so what he just said is really kind of the argument here is, based on something that we were just talking about, 20,000-ish, that means if we're using one scale, we may be different. And so Burlingame is a little lower than that, just to be honest. So if we're doing the 20,000 apples to apples, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
No,
I don't know, it'll be interesting to do that.
I mean, the purpose
That
of
was
the article.
today?
Yeah, the purpose of the article was to point out the disparities in education funding and also talk about parcel taxes that are out there.
Yeah. No, I definitely get it. I think Jennifer, I was gonna tell you something too, is one of the state talking about ADA versus full enroll, just general enrollment. That is a state issue that CSBA and other lobbyists have been trying to figure out what's the best way to go. And so legislation is kind of leaning towards one or the other. They haven't picked the lane yet, but it is definitely a debate, whether it's average butts and seats, average day attendance, or just enrollment numbers and just a flat, this is how many people you have. So that hasn't come to fruition yet, but that is an argument that's happening in the legislature right now.
And Greg, they may have paused part of that during COVID when a lot of students were absent during COVID.
Right. So they were giving some forgiveness.
Yes. I just one quick question.
Yeah.
Restricted funds, does that include the one-time, for example, the one-time COVID funding we had?
Yeah,
Well,
that's good. That's going to include
That's included.
almost
restricted.
all of the one-time
Yeah.
funding that it received is,
Yeah.
in fact, I can't think of any of the one-time funding that was not restricted in nature.
And a lot of the classes and stuff they have with CSBA about finances, and then in the Masters in Governance, they have really good information on the budgets and understanding everything. So yeah, you should take them.
Yancey, you could teach it. You're doing great.
Yeah, Yancy, you could, yeah.
All right.
All righty.
Sorry to interrupt, but that
No,
was really,
no,
I
I-
actually want to say I like the study session feel of that. So thank you. Sorry, Yancey.
Well, no, and like I said, 90% of our revenues sit in what we just talked about. Our secured taxes are $176 million. I mean, of our $220 million total budget. And when we look at increases year over year, that's the one number that we rely on in order to do the things that we'll talk about later and on the expenditure side. So no, that's the biggest number. So we should spend the most time on it. Moving on to federal revenues, we receive about $3.5 million, a little over $3.5 million. It's important to note in state and federal revenue, you won't see those one-time funding numbers right now because this was the first year on both the federal and the state side that there were not any one-time funding. And that'll get into our discussion of the step down of those one-time expenditures. Of that, a little over $3.5 million, special education through the federal IDEA is about half of it, about 1.9 million. But to clarify, the federal government's goal was to fund 40% of the cost of special education when IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was approved. They've never really been over 10%. And in our district, it's a little less than 5% of the cost that the federal government supports. The other revenues include the Title 1, 2, and 3 programs. I'll get into what those are. That's a little chunk of money. And then there's some other. So special education, I noted, special education is about 20% of our budget, a little over $40 million. Title I is the funds from the state that support our socioeconomically disadvantaged students. Title II supports professional development, and Title III supports English learners. We also get Department of Rehabilitation funds and Carl Perkins funds, which fund CTE programs. On the one time, they weren't on the list because we're not receiving them again, but are the ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 COVID relief funds. This was the second and third COVID relief bills that were approved by the United States government. The last being a couple of years ago now. Yeah.
Thank you. So the ongoing federal revenues there for special ed in the Title I and 2, would that be the same on page 6? This says state aid is 3.6 million.
On page 6?
Yeah, page 6 has our property taxes at 100.
No, the state aid for those are the old categoricals, as President Land was noting back from 2012 for non-community funded basic aid districts. Those were rolled into the LCFF and which districts received.
Okay.
But for basic aid, they would have gone away. So what the state said was, okay, we'll continue to fund those. We're going to count it against your $120 per student guarantee. And we're going to hold harmless, though. We're never going to increase it. It's just going to stay the same.
So where would this, on page 6, where would this 3.6 million be?
So it's not on page 6, but if you go
okay.
back into the overall budget on page 3.
Oh,
Sorry. They're both 3.6 million. I apologize. So it's on page 3, federal revenue of 3.6.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what
I see. And on page 5, it's there too.
Yep.
Got it.
Restricted. Got it. Overall budget.
Yep.
Mhm.
All right.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna let you go.
It's super quick. I was taking notes and I missed what you said. Title I is for,
Our socioeconomically disadvantaged students.
okay, that's what I thought. And Title II
Is around professional development, teacher
Okay.
development.
okay. And Title III is English learners?
It's English learners. Yeah.
Okay. Got
There's
it.
two sets of it, but yeah, they're both around English learners.
Okay, that's it.
My question, so for special education, has the federal funding increased in the last couple of years, or has it just been very static?
It has increased a little bit over the last couple of years, but not in the current budget. And there's not an expectation that it'll be increased. And as a percentage of the cost, it has not increased. It's actually decreased over the last several years.
My commercial is CSBA is trying to send us to the, Washington, DC each year. That is one of the major things we're trying to lobby is to increase that. So I think that would be nice to us to consider. Anyway.
Thank you. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
In terms of state revenues, in terms of actual dollars received, we receive in the budget about $6 million. That includes lottery funding, mandated costs, transportation. There's also a very technical thing, but I want to point it out. It's called the GASB 68 STRS conversion. And if you're not Trustee Griffin, I don't think you're very excited about it. But these are funds that are actually never received by the school district. They do never come to the school. They are funds that the state pays to STRS on the district's behalf. So the state is responsible for a portion of the state teachers retirement system. They just send us a number that we put on our books. So even though it says we get $13.5 million in state revenue, we only receive about $6 million.
Don't we have to keep that on our books though, as an in and an out?
Thank
And then
you.
doesn't that affect what we have to hold on to for our reserve, our required reserve?
It does. That's a great question. So you'll see later in there that the STRS amount is also inflated by the exact same amount. Basically, they just say, here's your number, 7.5 million, book it as revenue, book it as an expense, cash never goes anywhere,
But hold a reserve against it.
but you need to continue to hold a reserve against it. They
Against
did.
money we don't have.
They
Yeah.
did do one nice thing. They've let us exclude it from the routine restricted maintenance calculation, which is small wins, small wins.
Does it also count in the figure for Prop 98, the percentage of the state budget?
You know what? That's a good question. I would assume that it would be considered a portion that they're paying towards. There's almost nothing that they don't include towards
I
their.
just think the creative
requirements.
financing and, you know, goes back so many years. I mean, deferrals and all that stuff drives me nuts. So I just think it's ridiculous and we need to hold them accountable. So Gatsby is, so can you confirm with me the Prop
I will.
98? I would love to know if it's part of it or not.
Valerie, could you note that? Yeah, thank
Do you know what I mean by the?
Yeah, if it's included in
minimum-
that, yeah, if it's
The
included,
percentage, because it's like an artificially inflated
yeah,
number. And so I'm just curious because then we're really not getting what we need. And then
Yeah.
they're saying, well, we're giving you the minimum,
yeah, no, exactly. And I will say
which
to
is not even the
superin- yeah.
minimum that they're supposed to have. So
to Superintendent Booker's note, we definitely keep the liability on our books as well.
Mhm.
If you look at our financial statements,
Yeah.
they're very clear on whose liability that is. The states are ours.
before you
Um,
move on,
yeah.
just the mandated costs. So has that evolved? Because I remember we had to do all those mandated reporting costs and
Yep.
we had to use outside agencies to make sure that we're doing it right and getting
Yep.
our reimbursements. Is that still the same or has that changed a little bit? Is it now just kind of?
So it has changed significantly.
Okay.
So under Governor Brown, I'll hit this because it's the second of our bullet points here. But anything, the state constitution requires that the state pay for anything that it mandates that we do. The problem was that whenever there was not enough money to pay for it, they would literally put in $1 in the budget and then defer that money. Well, Governor Brown, speaking of, sneaky accounting ways to do things, he said, we know you're never going to get this money, or if you're going to get it, you're going to get it 5 years in the future. So if you take, a certain amount of money on the dollar, then you can be guaranteed this mandated cost block grant. And so the state has made it financially, really, it's the only way to go now. So every district accepts, there's a whole process of quote unquote what each mandate costs, and they put in a per dollar amount. And then every year we either opt in or opt out to getting that. We can still do the individual mandate claims, and there are a few districts who do that. The problem with that is anytime the state has given us unrestricted one-time money over the last 10 years, they've claimed that they're actually paying off old mandate claims. And so whether you're entitled to money or not, they're paying it off against that. So if you don't opt in, you're actually not going to get any more money. So
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I'm in awe just of the disgust that I have for the state legislature and their budgeting. But anyway.
So I know everyone talks about it, and people in schools, they're like, wait, you got the lottery, right? That pays for everything, right?
I haven't
Well,
seen that here yet.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the lottery is about 1%, a little less than 1% of our annual budget. It's actually even broken into two parts there. It's broken into an unrestricted portion and a restricted portion that is focused on instructional materials. So when Dr. Kempke comes and is adopting new curriculum, a lot of times the funding source will say lottery restricted. We have TUPE around drugs and tobacco. CTIG supports our career technical education. That's now ongoing funding, which is a good thing. This year is the first year of the transportation reimbursement grant. That's an important one because it funds up to 60% of related transportation costs. So two things to know of: when the district wants to increase transportation, it also has a chance to get that offset, by some additional revenue, but also when we decrease transportation services, you're only saving about 40 cents on the dollar because you're also losing revenue. We talked about the GASB 68 stirs on behalf, and anybody who wants to talk more can come get me after the presentation, and I'm happy to discuss it. In terms of the one-time, there's a lot more one-time money at the state than there was at the federal government, mostly related to the surpluses that the state was running through COVID. But the remaining ones that are included are the arts, music, and instructional materials block grant that the board approved a plan on using, the Learning Recovery COVID Relief Fund. This is the third and I'll get into this in a little bit, but basically the third round of COVID relief funds at the state level. We have the A through G completion grant. So that's to support our students being A through G college ready. Thank you. Our educator effectiveness grants, which really supporting some great PD in the district, as well as the California Learning Community Schools Success Grant, which was a competitive grant that the district got around increasing attendance for some students who needed it.
So art, music, and instructional materials, there's a one-time and then there's an ongoing one.
Yeah,
right?
That's
But
correct.
they're both restricted funds.
They are both restricted funds, although the art, music, and instructional materials block grant, surprisingly, with how many things it says that it can pay for,
It's more
it
broad.
actually it's incredibly more broad than
It's
that.
the least restrictive.
It's the least restricted,
Got
correct.
it. Jennifer.
You said that we approved a plan for that. I don't remember that. Can you remind
It
me?
probably was before that you were on the board.
Oh,
I think it was
okay.
in
This isn't-
September,
This
October.
isn't the new one that voters voted on?
No, that's Proposition 28.
Oh, okay.
And we haven't actually received the state.
That's the one that we cut $1 million out of that we had to know.
No, that's
See, this is what's confusing.
yeah, no, it's very confusing. So there's two different things: the arts, music, and instructional materials block grant, which
Yeah,
is
it's ongoing.
which is no, that's
No,
that's the one time.
Just-
Proposition 28 is not included in this, although it was approved. It was included in the adopted budget because still today we have not received our the amount that
I
the
don't know
district
the
will
number.
receive.
Yeah.
And what is it? What?
Proposition 28.
That one's Proposition 28.
We're
We are-
anticipating receiving it. We have not gone through the process of developing a plan, working with principals and staff,
Mm.
because we're not quite sure exactly how much, if there might be any significant restrictions. There might be some verbiage out there from the county office, but they're doing a lot of echoing or parroting what school services is interpreting, but that is very different than what the state actually requires
Mhm.
or directs on how we can spend the money, how much. So I know there's a lot of, we even talked about this in our principals
Yep.
meeting earlier this week. There is angst, like we're supposed to get this money.
Yeah.
We want to develop a plan. We want to spend it.
Yeah,
And so do we,
got it.
but we don't know how much and we don't know what the rules are yet. So we're waiting for that before we can really dive into a plan. I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that come second semester if CDE will give us instructions. But I'm not going to develop a plan or allocate money we don't have until I'm really clear from the state on what we can and can't use it for and how much each site will get.
Again, sorry, I have
Yeah.
to just clarify. So what Superintendent Booker's talking about is the ongoing ones that we
Correct.
haven't received yet.
Correct.
We did come up with a plan for the one-time block
Correct.
grant.
Yes.
And then we were told, no, you're not gonna get all that money. You're gonna get $1 million less.
Yeah, so the
Right.
state did the proposals, the governor's proposal actually was a fairly significant cut to that amount of money. In the end, the state cut a much smaller amount. And then in order to fulfill the commitments made in the board's approval, we have backfilled that small cut that was made to the arts, music, and instructional materials block grant in order for all the commitments that we've made to the sites.
Thank you.
In terms of local revenues, we've got about $4 million. Half of that is our facility use department. They're doing incredible. Back in COVID, they were down to $0. They do a great job of ensuring that our campuses are well taken care of and well used by the community when not needed by the sites. Interest is about $850,000, so a little under $1 million. And then we have a couple other things. One of the things included in the other are some of our generous foundations that are supporting some staffing.
Is that the
And so-
other?
That's included in the other. That's also, that other will increase as the year goes on, as we only include what commitments that we've already received in our budget. And as we receive additional money from PTAs or PTOs or the Athletics Foundation or the Arts and Music Foundations, we'll include that. So first interim, you'll see an increase in local revenue as it's received.
Can you touch a little bit on transportation fees? Is that other districts using our bus services and transportation services?
Yeah, it's a couple of things. It's also our bus passes from our Foster City buses.
Got it.
So,
and then interagency services?
When we use other public agencies, when they use our transportation services, it's just a different revenue that line we have to use. If it's a private company, they go into transportation fees.
Yeah.
If it's Burlingame Middle School that's using our services, then it's in interagency services.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. What's not in here, and it's a good point that Superintendent Booker is, the school district doesn't have a parcel tax, which is which a lot of the districts around here do have, and there are pluses and minuses to that.
I think we had one years ago.
Years ago.
Yeah. Maybe in the 90s. That was probably the last one.
Yep. So special education, as I noted, special education is about 40% of our overall budget. The revenue, 20% or about 40 million. Thank you. A little over 40 million. That was a really good catch. Thank you. The revenue for that is a three-legged stool, a mix of property taxes, federal and state revenue. The revenue accounts for around 30% of the costs of those services. And that's really due to the federal and state governments continuing not to meet their commitment for funding special education costs.
Could we call those mandated costs?
They're definitely mandated under federal law.
Going back to what you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But there's a difference between the state. The state is required to pay mandates under the state constitution. The federal constitution has no such.
I was specifically talking about mandated costs for state.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay. I'm going to transition into the expenditure side. This is a little more fun side of the budget. So again, we have just about a $220 million general fund budget around expenditures as well. Of that, 82% is salaries and benefits. As you know, we're in a people business. So what's included in salaries and benefits? So it's really broken into three different portions: certificated staff, classified staff. Those are salaries only. So who are certificated staff? Our teachers, our principals, our counselors, psychologists, and other credentialed folks like our TOSAs. Classified staff is really anyone who's not certificated. So it's a more broad group, but it includes classroom aides, mental health therapists, office staff, maintenance and operation folks, student nutrition, transportation, district office and departmental staff, business, HR, et cetera. In terms of benefits, you have two kind of forms of benefits. One, which are driven costs. So those are costs that are based on a certain percentage of a salary of the employees, certificated or classified. Those include pension costs, STRS and PERS, which we'll get into, Social Security and Medicare, workers' compensation, unemployment. And then the other form that's not driven as a percentage of that is your health and welfare benefits. And that's based on a cap that's negotiated between ourselves and our labor partners. It's the same again. So our salaries are about 70%, a little under 70% of our total salaries and benefits costs. And then the benefits costs are about 30%. Yeah, go ahead. That's okay.
Is STRS for certificated and PERS for classified, or do I have it backwards?
Correct. Yeah, the state teachers retirement system is STRS, and then PERS is the public employee retirement.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So, it's time to focus now. These next three slides are hit on my key takeaways. So, how do we determine the number of staff? a lot of it is dependent on formulas or ratios that we use. So a couple of just sample formulas. We have a 26-to-1 regular teacher ratio. We have a 22-to-1 special education SAI ratio. We have a counselor ratio of 370-to-1, an ELD teacher to student ratio of 20-to-1. Our academic support rate allocations are based on those unduplicated pupils. As I noted, those socioeconomically disadvantaged students, our ELD population, and any foster youth that we have. And then even on the, go ahead.
Sorry, when you talk about, so I got all the top ones, but when you get to the academic support, what positions are you talking about?
So a lot of those are teacher allocations.
TOSAs?
There
Or
are
just
some
extra?
TOSAs, but well, Dr. Kimke can
Sorry.
those. No, she's the expert.
So those would include classes like guided studies, AVID, different English support classes are usually funded. And I think the difference here is there's not a ratio. Those classes are, depending on what the class is, can be a differing numbers. So
Yeah.
I also want to remind the community, especially people watching from home, that, if they go back to the October 5th board study session, we spent 2 hours on this slide, basically, which is staffing and enrollment.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
we're not going to spend all that time again to this afternoon, but if people have a lot of detailed questions about ratios and staffing and how we staff schools and we had over 2 hours of conversation on that, and it was great. But I just want to remind the community they can go back and take a look there.
Absolutely.
And it was an excellent discussion.
Yeah.
I just think in this case, I wanted to know, because again, we want to maintain our program as best as possible, and especially with academic support. I was just wondering, yes, these are programs that we're listing, and I just want to make sure we know what they are so that when we talk about them later, that the insurance and not wanting to cut in this area is
Yep.
something that I want to emphasize. That's all.
Yeah.
Yep.
Making
And
that point.
Yeah, and those are based on our sites with more unduplicated pupils get
Right.
the larger share of those
Right,
allocations.
Right.
Okay, the second.
SPOE? You didn't.
Oh,
touch on
SPOE. SPOE is based on a CASBO formula, which is
SPOE is-
sorry, our yeah, our school plant operations employees, and so
classified
they're classified.
employees.
They're custodians but they also have a maintenance kind of
Right.
portion of their job.
Okay.
Yeah. The second piece, as we noted, a lot of those ratios were based on number of students. So what's driving those ratios? Well, our enrollment projections. We also noted that at the October meeting, October 5th. Thank you. And so I won't go over them too much, but just to hit that we hit a kind of the ceiling in our district a few years ago. We had been on a steady, slow increase for the last 10 to 15 years. And then the last couple of years, we've started a slow decline. One nice thing about being a high school district is that we have about 9 years of data of the students coming to us. So we know the students in our partner districts that are coming to us. So our enrollment projections are usually pretty close as we move forward. So we're looking at a slow decline projected over the next 5 to 10 years. The last piece around what drives our salaries and benefits costs is our negotiations and our collective bargaining with our labor partners. This slide includes the last 5 years of the salary increases, as well as, and I'll get into it in a little bit, the increases to the state pension contributions. Just to hit really quickly, the cost of 1% to all groups is approximately $1.4 million. In terms of benefits, I noted that there's two groups, one that are based on the percentage of salary. The first is our 2 pension rates. So all of our certificated members are in the state teachers retirement system, STRS, and they pay we pay 19.1% towards their pensions. Actually, to take a step back, well, no, I'll hit it.
You're going into it later, the
Yeah.
graphs later on.
I am. Thank you.
No worries.
So yeah, 19.1% for STRS, a higher percentage, 26.68% for PERS. Social Security, which is only for our classified employees. It's important to note that our certificated employees are not entitled to Social Security. We do not pay in and do not receive Social Security. Medicare for all employees is 1.45%. Workers' comp, just to note, 1.59 is a very low percentage. That's due to some great work that Kirk and his office do around safety. And our unemployment is a very low 0.05%, but that was much higher in the last couple of years related to COVID. It's finally back to its historical. Health and welfare includes to be a tiered employee cap that is negotiated with our labor partners.
Can I just want to say Social Security, again, on a federal level, California School Boards Association is trying to advocate for increasing and giving teachers an opportunity to be into the system and trying to change the laws on that. So, yeah. Thank you.
Say, Greg, I think President, I think that's great because great to bring it up because my understanding is that if a teacher is done teaching and they have another job and they pay into Social Security, they still can't can't take Social Security,
right?
And that's not.
It's pretty complicated,
Yeah.
but it does. If they do take Social Security, I think it's a dollar for dollar reduction to their state retirement.
Switch jobs.
So anyway, it's something that is trying to be looked at. Hopefully, a little bit more if we help it along lobbying wise. Anyway, sorry. Yep.
So in terms of our pension benefits, STRS and PERS. They're critical for attracting and retaining staff, but the rates are state mandated. And so for our public, I think it's important to note that the rates have increased over 100% since 12-13. And while we're getting to the other side of that increase, those were severely impactful to schools over the last 10 years. Put it in perspective, we could hire another 80 teachers with the amount
because they've increased the obligation, our obligation to pay these funds.
Correct.
And we've reached a ceiling, but they're allowing for a 1% increase over time.
You're going to talk about I'll note that in a second. Okay. And so the last thing is who determines the employer rates? STRS, for STRS, it's the legislature, with the exception of the 1% that President Land noted that a STRS board now has the authority to increase it. On PERS, it's completely different. The PERS board has full authority. So we find out in May, we have an estimate from them of what it's going to be, but we find out in May what the actual rate's going to be.
And this is where we see it.
So in terms of the STRS rate, it's 19.1 and projected out. And so any change would have to be made by the legislature, with the exception of the legislature has given the STRS board the authority to increase it by up to 1%. So that could increase to 20.1%. Overall, our driven rate on our certificated staff is about 22.3%. And when you look at our PERS rate and the total driven rate on classified employment or employees, it's actually a decent amount higher because of the higher PERS rate as well as the Social Security amount. So that's 26.68% on the PERS side. Overall, a 36.1% driven rate for our classified employees.
Now, usually you have STRS and PERS together, but can you explain to me the total? I get the STRS rate.
Yep.
But I don't understand the total
statutory rate.
Rate.
So the total statutory is the 19.1% STRS plus the 1.5% Medicare and the 1.5% workers' comp. Is a little bit different than that, but roughly.
But yes. Okay.
So that you add another 3% to that plus the unemployment, and that's the full driven rate in terms of
we're obligated to pay.
Correct. Plus workers' comp, plus Medicare, plus unemployment.
Yeah.
And then as well, PERS is the same, but also plus Social Security.
So one of the ways we think about it when we're talking about new positions that we want to add across the district, when we talk about it in terms of FTE, that's easy, 1.0 FTE or 0.5 FTE or whatever. But when we're talking about it with regard to cash, it might, and I'm going to make up figures just for the ease of math here. We might want to say on a classified staff member, that the staff member is going to cost us $60,000 in salary, but it's $60,000 plus what, 37?
36, yeah,
37 or
36%, yeah.
36%. Where are we there? Yeah,
Yep.
36%. So we have to always take that into account when we're looking at adding additional staff with regard to cash, how much it's actually going to cost us. It's not just $60,000, it's 60,000 plus total statutory benefits, or what we call, I always ask the question when we're talking about staff members, is that figure benefit driven all in? And then Yancey always says yes, because he knows to include
We
it
take that
way.
into account. A lot of
We
times
do.
when we do have these discussions, we do account for total compensation. And we
Yeah.
say,
But sometimes
what is the cost of the whole thing?
Right, but
You have to.
But sometimes the community will look at our salary schedule and go, a teacher costs X amount of dollars as it's listed on our salary schedule.
And that's a good point.
That's not true.
Right.
It costs that plus
Plus
the
benefits, plus
total
cost
Plus health
statutory
and
Benefit,
welfare.
like
retirement.
every
Exactly.
other Jobs, yeah.
It's multiple impacts.
Yep, that's a great point, Superintendent Booker. It's really,
Yeah.
it's important to look at the all-in average cost of an employee.
And would say that again, because that's what we do.
It's important to look at the all-in
all in
total cost of an employee.
total cost.
So health and welfare benefits, as I noted, aren't driven as a percentage of salary. They're based on a tiered cap that's negotiated with our labor partners. But as this chart shows you over the last 5 years, with COVID and some of the increases in inflation, we've seen a very large increase of over $5 million in our health and welfare costs, including, I think it was a 15% increase to our health and welfare costs this year. Our other significant expenditures, so 82% is salaries and benefits. What is the rest? So utilities, including water, waste removal, electric, and gas. We have a lot of special education costs that aren't specifically driven by staffing, non-public placements, non-public agencies, residential placements, other placements. We have our Gateway program, which is a partnership with San Mateo County Office of Ed. We buy equipment. And the biggest one of those is buses. We do a lot of professional development. We buy instructional materials. Our insurance and litigation costs are rising, especially with some changes in legislation and the recent fires across the state. And then deferred maintenance, we put about a 1.5% contribution to deferred maintenance every year.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I don't know if we were going to have a discussion about litigation and insurance.
Yeah.
Could we actually have some sort of conversation in public, or does it have to be a private closed?
So the insurance part, yes. The litigation part, no.
What do you mean, President Land, about conversation? Be a little more specific.
So if we were to say, okay, I'm very concerned about the increase in litigation costs that we have. We've gone from X to Y, and it's been a 30% increase. And I'd like to address that somehow and take into account blah, 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 blah. Where would that discuss? And I want to cut our litigation fees. Where would we have that conversation?
Well, those are two separate topics, right?
Are
The
they?
first topic is, hey, I want to know how much our litigation is costing us year after year.
Yes.
I think it's too much. I want to have a public conversation about that. That's a open session agenda item. That's actually public information. We have to report how much we spend on litigation, all those kinds of things. Now, we would never talk about individual people, cases, students.
I got
any of
it.
those
I got
things.
it. Yep.
Now, that's why I said this is two parts. That first part, really easy. It doesn't really get us anywhere, though, other than being transparent about we spend, and I'm making this up, everybody, $1 million on litigation every year. I'm making that up.
I
But
wish, but yeah.
whatever. The second conversation is much harder, and that is, I'm a board member. I want to have a conversation as to how we decrease our litigation.
Yes.
Where
does that?
We can have the conversation. Litigation is typically, from a school district's point of view, reactive. Right.
Yeah.
We're not litigating typically unless we are doing special education due process that we initiate. But other than that, it's very rare that a school district chooses to litigate. There are some other examples, eminent domain, stuff like that.
Yep.
But for the most part, it's lawsuits being filed against the district, and we have no control over that, whether or not we will suffer from a lawsuit. So to limit it, we can limit the ones that we choose to initiate from time to time. But how we react to things that come at us is very, very difficult. I guess that my last point is where we would have more detailed conversations is in closed session.
Yeah.
Because during that time, the board would determine whether or not they would like to settle a piece of litigation
Or
at
fight.
X rate
Yeah.
or battle.
Right.
And battle can be expensive too. And that's
Right.
where the board can make some choices around how much money do we want to spend. And typically speaking, when we're in closed session, we try to tell you that,
Yeah.
hey, settling is going to cost X. If we look to fight this case, we may win, we may not. It could cost Y. We're not quite sure, but
Yeah.
and then the attorneys kind of let us know that.
Bob,
You know, are you talking about the actual cost of litigation, which are the professional services? Or are you talking about the amount of damages that we end up settling for?
I guess I guess it starts with what Yancey said. We are having a dramatic increase in litigation costs and insurance costs. And so in theory, I was asking, because Superintendent Booker's absolutely right. It's like, it's a multiple prong approach, and you'd have to really have multiple conversations to figure this out. But in theory, my thought is, well, if it's increasing, what are we doing? Is there a way we could consider as a board to reconsider our policy and how we approach things and take a different take on things to reduce the amount of suing happening, or et cetera, et cetera?
So President,
And I don't have the full
Well, you know,
answer to
one
that.
thing, and when you say insurance
And I don't
and
mean insurance, I
litigation,
was
well,
really-
if you
yeah.
say insurance and litigation, you got to separate the two. Because
I'm really focusing on litigation.
Well,
I'm not focusing
litigation, you're probably the bigger piece of this is the strategy and the decisions that the people are directed by the board. One of the benefits of having an attorney on the board has been making, having a little insight into how to proceed.
I think I'm trying, you're reading my mind.
Yeah.
is what you're
And,
doing. So
that the other thing though, that's a little more controllable is who you hire and what kind of rates. But you need to have rapport with these people, and you need to have a lot of trust in them. So those relationships are not easily established. I mean, I'm not saying anything because we've gone back and forth with county
I knew it's very
council and
complex.
other people.
When I asked the question, I knew it was
Yeah.
complex, and I understood where Superintendent Booker's coming from. And I know that it's not an easy answer, but is it, the question I'm having is, should we consider tackling this, or is this just so out of our league that we just need to move on?
I do need to note one thing, and just to clarify a point that I made. When I noted that we're seeing the significant increase, it's on the insurance side. It's on the
Yeah.
insurance side
Thank you for telling me
related
that.
to certain kind of litigation, AB 218 that we've talked about, as well as
Totally know.
yep, and then the fires over the state of California.
So,
Go ahead.
Bob.
Oh, no, I was going to say several years ago, I think I asked for a report on special ed, and and I wanted to compare that versus the budgeted amounts and the amount of cost that
Now
we
you're
were
reminding me. See, now we're in the same page, because that's what started me worrying. Was, remember that one year when we had a dramatic increase, and we're like, wait a minute, what the heck? You see, nodding heads, you know where we're going with that. So I guess that's where I was coming from, is just generally that, like, hey, are we anticipating properly? Are we keeping it in line? It's a multiple prong question. And so it's complex. I don't have to have an answer for this, but it's something we should consider, is what I'm saying. Okay. I hate to, sorry, that was such a sidebar, kind of sidewalk, bird walk, but please continue.
The only thing I was going to say was, if it would please the board at some point, we may agendize just insurance as a topic, so that we can explain to you what SMUHSD is, not just to you, but to the community, our educators, what SMUHSD is, which is one of our insurance carriers, and how we work as a co-op throughout districts in the county, and what that looks like, and what they cover and what they don't. If the board would like something like that, I'm sure we could.
as long as it's
facilitate.
not a study session, a special study session.
No, just an agendized item during a board meeting.
What I was actually thinking of is maybe not a board meeting, but maybe in our weeklies or something, a report where it's like you can give us kind of here's what we are with litigation, here's where we are with insurance, just so you have an idea of where we're going. Okay. That might be a good idea. All right.
Great.
So as we move on from expenditures into fund balance, it's important to note our board's policy on the fund balance. Our board, the board has approved board policy 3100.01, which requires the maintenance of no less than 12% of a budget. It's included in two parts. The state required 3% reserve for economic uncertainty and an additional 9% unrestricted strategic reserve for economic uncertainty. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I was reading this last night, but so I just have a couple questions.
Yeah.
So thank you for putting this slide here. So what you have on the slide here captures the first bullet point on the policy. The second bullet point is the total, says the total 12% of unrestricted general fund reserve for economic uncertainty will be achieved over a period of time by incrementally growing the unrestricted reserve. Well, we've already grown that 12%,
Correct.
and we've already gone past that. And then my question is this policy was adopted July 15th, 2010, and the last review date was July 15th, 2010. So I was just wondering if the board ever reviewed this policy in the last 13 years and wanted to make changes. Probably not, because it hasn't been changed. And then but that's a question. And then the third bullet point of the policy says the board intends to adjust its unrestricted general fund for economic uncertainty to align to a level comparable to other basic aid school districts. So I was wondering if when this board policy was adopted and last reviewed 13 years ago, I was wondering who have we compared ourselves with in the past 13 years to keep that 12%?
So we continue to look at our comparable districts. We probably in the general fund, we probably keep a little bit less than some of them, although the increase in the last couple of years in COVID with the one-time funds has put us much more comparable with that. But we also keep additional funds around facilities and other things that for cash flow purposes or other purposes are in excess of what other districts use. I mean, we look at Palo Alto, we obviously look at our next door neighbor, Sequoia, and we look at some other comparable districts. But yeah, we keep in the general fund probably a little bit less, in our other funds, maybe a little bit more. So it pretty much evens out.
The interpreters are trying to get our attention.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm having a hard time because a lot of you guys are talking. The echo, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, some of you guys are going fast and there's a lot of overlapping. So I'm having a difficult time. So if you guys could just be mindful, I'd appreciate it.
My
Sorry
apologies.
about that.
Sorry about that. I forgot that. So thank you for that, Yancy, because I know that we're above 18%. We're riding along 18% just on part of it, just on the unrestricted funds, we're 18%. But if you total both the restricted and the unrestricted, then of course it's well over 18%. I know the board policy was 12%. So I was just wondering if the board had ever reviewed this since 2010, but my guess is probably not, since it hasn't been changed. I'm looking at those who've been on the board for more than 5 years here.
Well, no, there
Yeah.
was a time when we
Uh-huh.
were almost going to be mandated to 3%. Remember that? And then it got
It's still out
adjusted.
there.
No, well,
3%,
no.
yeah.
We're
The 3%,
exempt
we were-
because of that we're community funded.
So can you expand on that? Because I think
Yeah,
Trustee Chavez needs to understand that a little bit better.
yeah. So gosh, how many years
Well,
ago?
the 3%'s there, so it's 3 and 9. So
No,
figure that's 12.
no.
Mhm.
There was a time when the state legislator was only
Yes.
going to mandate us to 3% and and we needed to go down to that.
I think that's Ed Code 42127.
I don't think it was an ed code.
Yeah.
It was a.
It was part of a budget act.
Budget
Yeah.
And it was actually a last minute addition to
Yes.
the ad, and it required if certain things happened,
Mhm.
which actually I believe next year it will be implemented at some districts, there is a cap, and it's not an actual cap on reserves, but on projected reserves. But yeah, it's to the 3% reserve. And there are exceptions to that, small
Yeah.
districts, and I apologize, I think it's under
2501.
2,500. Yeah. Students are exempt,
Mhm.
and basic aid school
Mhm.
districts are exempt from that. That was a
Because our economic
subsequent.
certainty can
yeah.
be stronger. We don't have the same.
Yeah, so this letter, if I could just mention, this was from the Department of Education, Office of Tony Thurman. This is dated March 1st, 2023. And it's a cap on the reserves, and it's including It's including the both reserves. It's the, let's see.
This is what we were talking about.
Yes, so this is the restricted and unrestricted cannot exceed 10%. If you're, but the exception is if you're a small school under 2,501 pupils, and also if you're a basic aid
Yep.
district. And if you're not basic aid or your district has more students than 2501, then you can apply for a waiver from the county Office of Education, but not to exceed 2 years in a given 3 years. So my question is actually around this. So if our district flips into not becoming a basic, if we flip out of basic aid, then it looks like we would have to spend a lot of money all at once, right? Or maybe we'd have a year to spend that.
You
to get
get a
to 10
waiver, or you
because
get a waiver.
You get a waiver, but you can only have a waiver 2 out of the next 3 years. So,
But I don't think it's a
Yeah,
reality.
yeah.
It's not going to happen
right.
for us.
I'm just
There's
saying
a
that-
lot of districts that would,
So,
but ours is not.
right. I just want to make the point that a lot of if districts are not basic aid, then they're capped at only having 10% in both those buckets reserved. I'm sorry, I'm tongue twisted, not reserved. What's the word?
Restricted.
Restricted, thank you. So restricted and unrestricted together can only be a combined 10% and not $1 more. Yeah,
And that
Yeah,
is for LCFF funded,
yes,
not basic
Right. And
aid,
if
not
we-
community funded, which
exactly,
we are.
which we are. But
So
if we-
we're not, this doesn't apply
Right,
to us.
we're one of the 2 exemptions. The other exemptions is a
Right.
small school districts. But if we ever flipped, I guess we'd have a problem. We'd have to.
And I'm going to say, I
Yeah.
don't think we're going to ever get
Okay,
flipped,
all right.
but I think and it's interesting because this is exactly what we were talking about,
Mhm.
because originally they were going to be as harsh as 3% originally.
It's 10.
And then, but the only reason for that is our state senator Hill actually helped us, which is why he got legislator of the year for our area, because he helped us because it was a huge change that needed to happen, and it did. So, the whole idea of small districts and exemptions and community funded
Right.
is because of our uncertainty liability that we need to have in case of certain problems and economic uncertainties and other uncertainties that we would have that we're not insured, we don't have a buffer for that the LCFF districts would be able to have. So.
No, thank you. And Trustee Chavez has gone and pretty much done my next slide for me as well. No,
Sorry
thank
about
you.
that.
We're moving on. So yeah, we've at the end of last year, we had about 18% included in our unrestricted budget. And because of those significant one-time funding, we have about 13.7 million in restricted. As you can see over the last 3 years, that restricted side has grown considerably, related to primarily the state one-time COVID and other funds.
If we took those out,
Yeah.
what is the percentage that we would have for this basic aid contingency or the ending balance? I mean,
It still is the 18% is that the restricted is on top of that.
No, I know that. What I'm trying to say is, what would our ending balance percentage, or what are we calling this? Yeah, if we took out the one-time funds,
It would be
it would be
18%. Yes, correct.
Oh,
Yeah.
Hmm.
So if you take the restricted and then restricted, it's 21%. So if you had both the
So this is where I think Ms. Chavez and I might have some agreement.
so the 34.5 million and the 13.7 million together with both revenue streams right there is 21%. So you take out the one-time funding, you're at 18%, which is right there.
And
I'm glad you helped me elucidate
Sure.
me on that one.
I reviewed this, this afternoon when it was
That's a
posted.
lot.
Yeah, I
So
will note
Totally a
that-
lot, and other school districts can only have 10. We have 21%.
Got it. Point made.
So is because there's a lot there, are you maybe suggesting that we can pull from there to cover? Okay,
Sort of, thank you.
okay.
Hold on. So
I just wanted to
before
know
we
where that was
start
going.
spending all kinds of money, let's remember that contingency dollars are in a sense one-time dollars. So it wouldn't be smart, for instance, to spend it on FTE. Hey, we want to keep a position, so we are going to dip into our contingency to pay for that position. Well, contingency is like a little mini bank account, like a little mini savings account. It doesn't necessarily get replenished. So if you spend it out, it goes away. Do you know, Yancey or Ms.
Yeah.
Miller or Ms. Castano, do you know what 1 month of payroll is across our district? This is how I was always trained to think about it, right?
Yeah. So yeah, 1 month is a little over 8% of our annual budget. So when you look at the Governmental Financial Officers Association recommends a 2 month
Right.
which is about 17%.
And the reason why they do that is because in years past, I remember this is pre-COVID, but when we were in the Great Recession and all that kind of stuff, the state, they were late on giving us money. I don't know about San Mateo Union, but my previous district, we wouldn't get in our apportionment on time. And we worried about making payroll all the time, worried about making payroll because our contingency was barely, with magic tricks and smoke screens and rabbits out of the hat, 3% reserve, barely. And sometimes we worried about not making payroll because apportionments didn't come from the state. We don't want to be there.
So
That's
I
my
totally
warning.
Agree. However, I totally agree with that. And yes, you need to think of it differently. You're not, if you're going to spend down a percentage and we're going to use salary, yes, we have to be very careful what that's going to look like. We are not deficit spending as of this at this point in time, correct?
We are deficit spending this year, but primarily that's
Only the one-time fee funds.
It's related to we might be showing a small deficit. I'd have to double check, but the primary we have a little over unrestricted and restricted of a $3 million deficit in the current year. That's primarily related to one-time funding, although that number does not include the additional one-time funding that we approved around health and welfare costs for 2024.
I think, just to be realistic, I understand what you're saying. You don't want us to deficit spend, because if we deficit spend with salaries over time, it's going to be a problem. And that's what Mr. Superintendent Booker is saying. I don't disagree.
Yeah.
But having a very inflated reserve is concerning. And I think we need to consider that, and when we are budgeting. So that's all and I think it's a balance. It's like, let's not go crazy. All right. No, but I'm saying, let's not go crazy, but we're in a good financial position. And we need to consider how much of a reserve we want to continue to have over a regular basis.
I will note that our reserve balance is right around or a little bit under the state average right now for school districts.
You mean like the 10%?
No, nobody's at that after these years, especially because of all of the restricted funding that districts have received. But yeah, school services puts out a thing every year. My percentage that I'm using is at the end of the 22 year. So it doesn't include the 20. We don't have that data yet from school services, but a little over 20%. It was the statewide average for reserves.
But the letter from Tony Thurman's office says that you can get if you're not basic aid, you can have an exemption, and you have to provide a statement that substantiates the need for combined, assigned, and unassigned to exceed that reserve cap. You have to identify and associate what you're identifying with extraordinary financial circumstances, but you can still only have 2 years out of 3 years. So at some point, a school district that's not basic aid is going to have to be within that 10% cap.
So that is if certain things
Criteria
apply.
met.
So that's been around, I think, for 5 or 6 years.
This
Next year will be the first year that will be triggered.
Yes.
And it has, and I apologize, I'm not as we're exempt from it, but it has relations to the state reserve for Prop 98. There's a couple other things. We're in a test Prop 98. I forget if it's a test 1, test 2 year. There's, I think, 3 triggers to it.
Yeah.
And this was the first year that we've hit all 3 triggers at the end of the year.
And I apologize. I did forget to say it's for fiscal year 2023 to 2024. So we might see those state averages across the 1,000 school districts we have in California. We might see those averages, those caps, the reserve caps decline as a result of this being put into place. This letter's dated March 1st, 2023, but it's for fiscal year 2023 to 2024, starting with that.
Yeah.
Bob,
it always concerns me when we talk in the hypothetical about spending money and we don't have any specific plans and we don't try to align it with a strategic plan. And we just think it's a little too high. Now, our fortunes ride with the economy, and the state is not going to bail us out, if we have issues, and if we build an ongoing machine that we can't control, or we lack the ability to control it. So, I mean, I think the last economic meltdown was 2008. And I don't, and that was pretty severe, banks failing and stuff. So I, keep that in mind and try to keep, your savings account at home doesn't go up like that unless you win the lottery or unless you inherit money. It does go down like this. You'll look up and it'll be empty. Or I think our reserves are much like that. So just kind of be,
I totally
temper your thoughts.
I love that. I think temper is the right way. But the flip side of that coin is I don't want to hear, or I'm concerned when, just as when you say, let's build up, let's take away, let's reduce, when we're in such a current financial situation, and then I'm going to hear cut. I can't justify those cuts. So again, it's a two-sided coin, which if you don't look at the other side, you're going to be in trouble. So I totally agree with you. And I'm glad we have at least a CPA on board still. We may not have a lawyer, but at least we have a CPA who's going to say, hey, let's be reasonable about it. But again, I think we have to be cautious here. It's not, oh my God, the sky is falling. And it's like, oh no, we're in heaven. It's neither. It's let's see where we are. And because again, this is a study session to talk about budget and talk about what do we want in the future. I don't think we're in a place where we're saying make dramatic cuts. By the same token, we're not in, hey, let's build a whole new, fantasy world, right? So I think that's kind of where I'm coming from.
And the other thing I wanted to add, President Land, is that it's prudent to have savings. And obviously, I think we would all agree to that. And I know we count this as a rainy day fund, but we went through a 2-year global pandemic. The government, we can't always forecast or always count on that the government's going to say, here's a bunch of one-time funding for COVID relief funds, right? And so that's partly why we have that restricted funding left. So I don't think we spent $1. I'm willing to go out there on a limb. I don't want to bet dinner because, I like to eat, but I'm willing to bet that we didn't spend $1 of any of our ending balances from prior years on anything COVID related, because we still have remaining balances from our COVID funds that the state and federal government gave us, but we can't always count on that. I'm just saying that's the way we say rainy day fund in case we need it. But look, we just went through a 2-year COVID,
Bob?
Yeah,
then
if you notice when I talk about spending money, I want to hear and I want to evaluate what it's for.
Yeah.
What the impact is,
totally.
and so I just totally reserve, but I'm just saying, it's not, it's what are we doing with the money?
Yep.
It's like so many things that you do, let's spend it wisely on effective programs.
I think this is where we're totally agreeing.
Yeah.
Yes. Jennifer?
And my question, I don't think anyone has an answer for me at this point in time, because you probably have to dig it up. But when this policy for the 12% in 2010 was formed, what was the reserve at that time? That's what, and so like, how long did it take to build it up? To Bob's point, you can spend it down a lot faster than you can build it back up. That's kind of
Nancy has the page here that goes back 5 years.
Yeah,
Goes back
I
to
can get
2018.
exactly the information,
I was just
but we were
curious, but-
close to or almost under 3%, correct? Back in 08 or 09, right
Okay.
around there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when the financial crisis hit, a lot of districts tanked and had barely any reserves, and we were deficit spending like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
And that's
Okay.
what was
And there
happening.
were significant actions that had to be taken by the board at that time. I'm sure
Pink
Trustee
slips.
Griffin has the scars on those for those, and then it steadily built up as the economic changed, and kind of more importantly, when I note back to secured property taxes, when our secured property taxes recovered and had a few strong years in the early 2010s, were when we were able to do that.
The cautionary tale that Bob, both Trustee Griffin and Superintendent Booker are talking about is when it really gets bad,
Yeah.
that money disappears fast.
Right.
Because,
Right.
and I got to say, districts like ours that are doing this kind of reserve at this percentage will be able to insulate ourselves when the things go bad. So what happens, and unfortunately, when you've been on a board as long as Bob and I have, and Terry to some degree, I think, those cuts were dramatic. And if people weren't prepared, if people were at the 3, 4, 5% reserves,
Yeah.
they were cutting teachers. They were increasing class size. You were pink slipping tenured teachers, and it was a dramatic shift, and it was huge cuts. Yeah. I mean, so, when they say doom and gloom, they mean it, and it's ugly.
I
And,
believe it, yeah.
and so we've been down that road. So having a decent percentage reserve is healthy.
Yeah.
It's just when we're
Trying to
really
find the right
healthy,
balance.
that's all I'm saying.
The
I get
balance,
it.
and then also trying
Anyway.
to forecast the future. I don't think our property values are gonna be reduced by 50%. It's gone up by about 50% or 100.
Well,
it's gone up by
maybe what we
100%
want to
last
do is talk about what a cap would be. Maybe.
That's another.
That's an
Yeah.
idea.
Anyway, we sorry to detract,
No,
but it's a
no,
very
I-
healthy
I-
conversation.
It's a good conversation. I'll hit on these last couple of things because we've pretty much talked about them actually in here. The remaining restricted grants, I noted the two big grants that were received in the current year. The first was the Arts, Music, and Instructional Materials Block Grant, which the board prior to the changeover of the board approved the spending plan on that. And then that's about 5 million. And then the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant, that's the remainder of the third COVID grant and potentially the last COVID grant. And lastly, I'll move into multi-year projections. We're required by state law, but also by being good fiscal stewards to look at multi-year projections. And so in that, we have assumptions that I'll get into, but we continue, we spend down a little bit that ending fund balance. And that ending fund balance is the unrestricted side only as a percentage. And so it goes down a little bit in 23, 24, a little bit in 24, 25, but then with the secured property tax growth built in, it goes back up a little bit. It's important to note that for 24, 25 and for 25, 26, there are no salary increases listed in here, even though we have assessed valuation growth built in here. So that's an important thing that's not in there. In terms of
Going
assumption.
back,
Oh, yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
In your multi-year, we have 0% for salary increase.
Correct.
When's our next negotiations?
Early next
Open?
year.
Okay. Next
Or
year.
early, I mean, early next.
2024 or 2025?
Yeah, early in
January, February.
calendar 24.
Calendar 24.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. In terms of assumptions, I'll just hit on a couple real quick. Assessed value, where the adopted budget had about 6.1% in there based on at the time, which will be pretty close. We have 3.5% for the out years. Those have been relatively conservative estimates, but also not having a salary increase put in there is not is on the opposite side of that. So the other couple of things to note, our projected enrollment is pretty steady with a little bit of a decline in it. The CalPERS rate is projected to continue to increase. Those projections are not ours. Those are from the PERS board that has put out those projections. And then our FTE, this includes all board approved step downs and board approved positions for 23, 24, as well as the out years. I think we've done most of the questions, but if there's any questions before we get into the one-time COVID expenditures. All right.
Any
Yeah.
questions?
Just
Jennifer?
Yeah.
make sure I understand. So the assumptions on the FTE for the out years
Correct.
are based on your projected enrollment formula?
Yeah, those are based on the staffing that's given to us by HR.
Yeah.
And any changes that have been approved by the board.
President Land, Mr. Childress from
Mhm.
DTA has his hand raised for public comment if you want to take it.
Yes. Craig, you there? Oh, okay. We're promoting you up. I bet Craig's going to ask what I was going to ask.
I don't
Mr.
know. What were you
Childress,
going
you
to
can-
ask, Greg?
I'm going to let you go first.
Okay. Um, First of all, a couple of things. I'm glad you guys are doing this. It's really great to have a thorough look at the process. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, and I didn't plan on speaking, but a couple of things came up. And first of all, the reserve, just on the reserve, anecdotally, I'd love to hear the dates Yancey comes up with, how fast we built up that ending balance. I remember it had to be, I think it might have been even before 2008, but the district had an ending balance that was not only below 3%, it was deplorable. It was very low.
Yeah.
And that was the year before Liz came. And I think we were up well into the 9 to 12% within 2 to 3 years. After that, a lot of that did have a lot to do with facilities use and, cutting, tightening the ship, so to speak, or tightening our belt, so to speak. But it is difficult to do in a short period of time when you have to make difficult choices. However, I do agree with sort of the sentiment that we should be looking at those funds in a meaningful and thoughtful way as we think about making sure the money gets into the classroom for the kids. The slide 20, which was the ratios for, and I'm trying to do 3 things at once here tonight, but I can't seem to. But slide 20 with the ratios, I would just point out that none of the numbers that you see on that page are actually negotiated in our contract. I'm going off memory because I can't pull up the slide, but we have an agreed upon ratio of 27.5 to 1. So if the district is actually staffing at 26 to 1, that's great, but let's put it in the contract. 22 to 1 for ed specialist caseloads, that would be great to have in the contract if that's what we're doing and we can afford it, and we clearly have a large ending balance. 370 to 1 for counseling, that would be great to have in the contract. We've been proposing these numbers for over a decade. So it would be great to have those things in the contract if we can afford it and still maintain an ending balance. 20 to 1 for ELD. I'm just going off memory. So if my numbers are incorrect, I just know
You're doing pretty good.
Contract.
You're
You got a really good memory.
100% right there.
Those are numbers that we should be at least having a more meaningful collaborative discussion at the bargaining table about those numbers going into the contract, if we can afford it and still have a large ending balance. So those were just a couple of things. And Greg, thank you. I'm glad that I think we've had this conversation before about CSBA looking at the GEP and the WEP, the windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset. It does affect teachers in only 15 states, if you can believe it. Only 15 states do offset pensions for teachers who might have vested or any vested interest in Social Security. It not only affects teachers, but it also affects spouses and survivor benefits should there be a situation like that. And even if you are if you are a teacher on pension and your spouse had Social Security, it will affect your survival. It can affect your survival benefit as well. CTA and NEA have long been advocating for moving in the direction of eliminating those provisions, not necessarily to require teachers to pay into the provisions, because as you know, the STRS system is a well-functioning and well-supported system in the state. However, the fairness part of it is something that we feel very strongly about. And so I appreciate, sorry, I'm using first names, but Trustee Land's.
Don't worry.
I appreciate Trustee Land's advocacy for that. And those were just a few things that came off the top of my head while I'm doing another Zoom call on another computer. So thanks very much.
I'm glad you
Thanks, Mr. Childress. Appreciate it. Okay.
Spouse benefits, because it affects that as well. Yeah.
That was part of what we were, part of the Coast to Coast was doing last time. So, okay. Well, appreciate that. Thank you. Any more questions and comments on the?
We have a whole nother section.
No, I know.
Okay.
But I'm asking at this point in time, is there anybody asking on the?
No.
Okay. Any other questions regarding what we've been
I know we're
talking
not done
about?
yet. I want to say thank you to Yancy and Vanessa and Valerie. So thank you for putting this together. I
Yeah.
know we're not done yet.
No, I know that. And then we're getting to the one time and the step down and all that. We understand that. But again, really doing the study session, going intense, it is really good to have this detail because again, going back to the book that we read, it's important that we become educated and be on the same level so that we can have the discussions at this level. Because if we don't, then we can't have those deeper discussions of, okay, what are we spending and who's we keeping and who are we not keeping, which is the real issue sometimes when we're building budgets. Right. So anyway, with that, we are going to the next part.
We're going to go on to the next part. Thank you. All right. In terms of step down of one-time expenditures, the one-time funding came in really kind of three waves, and all throughout the COVID period since March of 2020. The first wave was the initial funding around federal funding and state funding around really very specific pandemic relief. The CARES funding, if you remember the CARES funding, the first ESSER funding from the federal government. As that continued, excuse me. We went into kind of a second phase, and that was related to the second ESSER funding at the federal level, as well as some surpluses at the state level, which added a few new programs, including ELO, if you remember approving the ELO plan several years ago. And then in the third phase, which was the final federal COVID relief bill, and then these two large instructional materials, arts, music, and instructional materials block grant, as well as the learning recovery emergency block grant. I apologize. Hold on one second.
Can we get you water?
I think I'm good now.
Okay.
Thank you. If I do it again, yes. And so these grants are the remaining funds that we're still spending out of. The first is the two A to G access, success, and learning loss mitigation grants. The second is the arts, music, and instructional materials block grant. Those can be spent over the next few years. The board has already approved the plan on that. The California Learning Community School Success Grant, which I noted, which is about $2 million grant to improve student attendance. ESSER 2, 3, and 3 learning loss. Those are the two federal COVID relief bills, the last two. And those can be spent. ESSER 2 had to be spent actually about a month ago. And then ESSER 3, we have another year on. And then the ELO, that's the very end of the expanded learning opportunity COVID grant. And then the learning recovery emergency block grant. So we've received a little over $20 million or over $20 million in one-time funding over the last several years. We had added some positions related to the COVID relief that was specifically identified to support our students during the COVID period. And in the second and third phases, we were actually able to somewhat expand that and then expand the timing. So initially, we were looking at stepping down some of these investments a couple of years ago. We continued to receive some additional funding, which allowed us to extend that. And then we were in the current year budget, the federal government, it's not projected that we're going to receive any more federal funds on this one. And then this year was the first year we did not receive any state funding. And so I'll go on to the next slide, where in the spring, when the governor's budget did not include any one-time funding, we formalized the step-down plan, which came to the board in March with the second interim. And this includes the 24.46 positions that are currently in the budget related to or funded by that COVID funds, and then the step-down of the step-down plan that was approved, which slowly in the first year, and then a more significant reduction in the second year, and then in the middle in the last year in 26-27, with all the remaining positions stepped down.
All right, let's pause
Yeah.
there for a second. So I just want to remind the board and the community. So we brought this to the board in March. The board approved it. We came back in our study session in the late spring and reviewed this again. At that time, a couple of board members had concerns, shared concerns about some of the positions that would be going away over time with this soft money dissipating. So in hearing some of the board's concerns, specifically around mental health and some other positions, and also hearing from principals around some of their concerns around a couple of these positions, district staff have been meeting with principals in last spring and now very much so into the fall to talk about what of these positions are prioritized by principals and what might we go about shifting some of these positions based on principals' feedback, board feedback around prioritization, shifting some of these positions to the general fund. Now, by doing that, what that really means is finding either new sources of income to pay for them or making cutbacks on the general fund to pay for them. I wasn't going to go and approve a plan that just added positions to the general fund without some type of plan to pay for them. So in a lot of conversations with principals, district staff, Brian and Lulu back there, and a number of other folks, we've come up with a plan based on the feedback that we received from principals to adjust some of this step down to keep a few of the positions moving forward. Not all of them, mind you, but I want to remind the board that when we look at all of these positions, they're not all going away in 1 year. This is a 3-year step down plan, and we may have further conversations next year or the year after. We may get new monies, we don't know. And we'll have to have this same conversation with principals and district staff each year as we look at positions that are going away with soft funds. And if we're prioritizing them, how would we keep them? What would we cut, or what new funds might we get? You want to go on to the next slide? Okay, so it was prioritized by principals, and I did hear from a couple of board members last spring during our study session to retain our mental health therapists, student success coordinators, and campus safety specialists. Now, mind you, we have these positions already. The ones that are listed on the slide are the additional positions, the additional FTE paid for by soft money. So I want to be clear. If this FTE, this 11.5 FTE did go away, it's not as if we wouldn't have any mental health therapists or any student success coordinators or any campus safety specialists. That's not true. We do have these positions in place and intact. Soft money paid for additional ones. The principals were strong, coordinated, in solidarity around their interests and in their enthusiasm to retain these positions because of what they're doing for students.
Mm-hmm.
This equated to about $1.2 million annually if we were to shift it to the general fund. I don't have $1.2 million of new funding coming in, so we had to be creative in how might we shift the general fund, cut back on the general fund to afford these positions. So we can go to the next slide.
So can
go
we take
back.
some questions and comments.
Let me just finish on
Okay,
how I'm going to pay
okay.
for it, the
All right, let's do
recommendation
it.
on how to pay for it.
Let's do
Yeah,
it.
let's just finish this part.
Okay,
Alright.
so we have some site-based teachers on special assignment that we would look to reduce. We every year, this is superintendents before me as well. Every year we develop staffing at each school site, and issues occur in the spring and sometimes early in the fall where principals might need an additional section. If you remember last year, we talked about providing additional sections at Cappuccino for different areas, or Peninsula, or other sites. That can equate, I don't want to say on average, but that can equate up to about 6.0 FTE annually in what we call staffing above formula. So this is staffing that principals come to me and make their case as to why they might need additional FTE here or there. As an example, they might have a 0.8 math position but they have a really fantastic candidate that is only going to take the position if it's 1.0. And we might be really struggling in finding math candidates. So this is an example of where I might increase the FTE by 0.2. So that would be 0.2 staffing above formula. So they can go and grab that and hire that math teacher. So I'm suggesting that rather than having a staffing above formula in my back pocket of up to 6.0, that I would reduce that by 2.0 FTE. It still allows me to have some FTE in my back pocket to support principals as they come in the spring and in the fall for additional FTE, but just not as much. Additionally, we would look to reduce our COVID health aides. They were on the list to be reduced over time. We were just asking that we reduce them earlier, and that would be 3 FTE. We still have health aides across the district. That's not to say we're reducing all of our health aides. These are just the additional ones that came through with COVID. And then looking across district, our district office departments and recommending that we reduce our budget allocations by about $100,000. This gets us to about $1 million. We're not quite there yet in our recommendation, but between now and first interim, if the board approves or gives us the thumbs up to head down this plan, I believe that we can still identify an additional $200,000 to meet the need to shift this 11.5 FTE from soft money to general fund. And so that's my recommendation, hearing some input from the board last spring, certainly a significant amount of input from the principals to try to address, if you go back one slide, to try to address and retain those positions right there. As a part of, go back one more slide, that long list. So that long list, that doesn't mean all those positions, actually none, if you look at that list, no other positions will go away next year, I don't believe, other than the ones we just listed. Maybe one, I can't remember.
The teacher COVID allocation,
that.
that's already been stepping down for the last 3 years.
The 3.2.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's already only 2.0 this year. It was set back in, I think it was up to 5 FTE in the first year, and then it was 4, 3, 2, et cetera.
Yeah.
Comments?
Thanks, everyone. This is a great idea, the study session. I wanted to mention the projected enrollment on page 21. I don't know if this is on, but I'm not loud enough anyway, sorry. So if we look at the enrollment from 2023 of 8,661, and I know this is forecasted, we don't have a crystal ball, but the enrollment for 2028, 7,792. And we just for comparison purposes, 2023 to 2028, that's a reduction of 869 students. That's 10% of, we're forecasting to have student enrollment decline by 10%. Now, naturally, we're not going to, I'm hoping we're not going to go around and say we need to reduce teachers, the number of teachers by 10%, but I know that we'll have natural attrition, people retiring, moving, just attrition in general. So I think there's some not savings, but where I'm going with this is I'd like to see a shift in making sure our students have what they need as far as their support. I know the board's heard a lot from Peninsula that they need more support for the students there that are most at risk. And I know that there's other areas that need more support. I think about some of the spotlight, I'm tongue twisted here, spotlight on education, spotlight reports that we've received recently. There's certain cohorts where I know it's just one test, the CASP for the 11th graders. And, you know, we had certain demographics, 75% of the students met or exceeded the state standard, whereas some demographics, it was 16%. Can we possibly use some shifting some funds and providing more support? And Dr. Kempke has done a wonderful job on our equity committee. I wonder if Dr. Kempke, I know no one has a blank check to say, here, what can you use this money for to help us with equity around the district? But I just know that there's some ideas out there to get the dollars to the classroom to help the students who need the most support. And that's where I was going with looking at our 21% reserve. I know some of it is restricted, but 18% of it's unrestricted. I'm not saying, hey, let's go out and buy a bunch of things. That's not where I'm going, Trustee Griffin. I do appreciate you're saying, hey, no, we're both finance folks. Right? Everyone here has become finance folks tonight, right? Because that's what we're tasked with doing. And I think this is very exciting work. I love numbers, but so I just think it's very prudent to take a look at what do we need going forward. Let's make sure we still have our revenues coming in at a steadily increase because of property values, right? So it's all factored in here. And you guys did a wonderful, wonderful job on the presentation. That's where I'm going with looking at that reserve that we currently have, and also the decline in enrollment, the forecast decline of 10%. So that'll pick up if there's attrition. If there's attrition with staff and there's attrition with students, that's a natural pathway to say, hey, we can capture some of that as well, looking out the next 5 years. But I'm just really passionate about helping the students who really need the extra support, and we discussed that in our equity advisory committee meetings. That go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think you bring up a really good point. The board, one of the board goals is to talk about student achievement, is to talk about equity. Those are two main goals of our board. And if we want to be true to those goals, how do we fulfill them? And what you're trying to say is let's devote finances and money to it to be good, to be clear. No, I'm just summating. And, going back to what Bob, you said, this is good. This is really good because you went, talk to the the principals, talk to what's going on. You have a plan. It's logical. It makes sense. It's what we need. It's not 100%. Let's throw everything back in because we have this huge reserve, and how to do it. The only thing I'm going to have contention with is that last page where it's where are we getting the money? So for me, my point would be, you have teachers on special assignment. I would like to know more about why would we want to cut that? Because I think a lot of the programs that we have, I want to maintain, and I don't feel like we need to cut, especially because of the reserve that we have. Staffing above formula, that kind of goes to what you were talking about with attrition and stuff. Maybe that's just going to go away naturally in a way. COVID aids, I'm totally fine with. District office budgets, 100, I totally get it. So I think the first two for me are something that I would like to reconsider. Everything else, great. I love it. We're on track.
So what we can do is we can provide some more background into what those positions are, why we're recommending a
Or
reduction
options.
in a weekly.
Or other options as well, because I wouldn't approve this, is what I'm going to say.
Different scenarios.
So Bob,
Normally I'm really in favor of closer to the classroom, the better, but I'm really in favor of, the world changed. It just seemed with COVID, and we need to have mental health therapists out there. I think, we're seeing the world every day, and it's just a different place. And campus safety, those are like mental health and campus safety. We have to provide that safe learning environment. And we've got people that are just totally stressed out. And you wonder, well, homework may be or academic achievement's probably the last thing on their mind when they wake up.
Yeah.
So, the one thing on the, converting these to ongoing or at least semi-ongoing is how would you allocate the resources and what's already out there? And that's a question that I'm sure the administration can address. Because I think this is a good idea. Now, is it enough? I don't know. Will all schools get pro rata shares, or do some schools now don't have any? Or are we sharing? And so I think we need to know more about how the resources are being allocated or what the proposal is.
It goes back to what Greg was saying about what's important, and our budget will reflect what our values are. And like you're saying, what's important to us right now? What is on the LCAP? What are our goals? And so when we make these decisions, we've got to take a step back and think okay, what do we truly believe in? So I think I listening to what everyone's saying, our students are at the forefront, but what is the most important thing for them?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Definitely looking through an equity lens. So, but I think really paring it down to talking with the principals, having that key services to retain on that slide, I think as a group, we totally agree that that's something we want to retain. And I think you did a great job of saying, okay, this is what we don't need, but this is what we need. And principals are really advocating for it. So it's good. When we get to the cuts though, I think we need to revisit that. I mean, when we start talking about building the budget and where are we going to reduce services, I concern myself with what teachers on assignment are we cutting? Why? What does that really look like? Staffing, how does that kind of flip, going back to what Terry was talking about, like what's attrition, what's not, how do we formulate that? Because again, equity, do we want to have more funding for Peninsula? And, maybe those two need to go there or somewhere else in the future. And I'm not calling where and how, I'm just saying that needs to be a fudge factor. The other two, the COVID aids, we totally understand why we need to eliminate that. We understand the departmental reductions. We get that. So I'm just saying my suggestion, and again, I'm not speaking for the board, I'm just speaking for me, is what are some other options? What are some things that you can look at might be if we need to cut? Or I think if you look at this side of the room, or at least two of us, we were talking about that reserve can be reduced a little bit, not dramatically, and what does it look like over time? So that is something to consider. And I think that's kind of where we're.
And then if we reduce it just slightly over time, it might make up for itself when we have attrition, because we're forecasting a 10% reduction in enrollment, which, and I also think mental health is super important, to just piggyback off what Trustee Griffin said.
And we have a very healthy reserve. We don't want to eliminate it by any stretch of the imagination. Even Mr. Childress was saying, hey, there was a time when we knew when it was bad and it was hard to bring it back, and it even took a few years. So we get that.
I would recommend that, and I agree that it is a good reserve. It is not a significant reserve when you compare it to what other districts have right now, and it would not be my recommendation to drop it. Go ahead.
No, please.
My recommendation, I go with the Governmental Financial Officers Association recommendation of about it's a 16 2/3% reserve, which is 2 months of payroll.
Is that CASBO?
No, it's the Governmental Financial Officers Association recommendation.
It's not CASBO though. What is CASBO recommend?
CASBO defers to the governmental.
Okay. I guess what would help us in this instance is maybe a little bit more research background of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because what districts are over 16%, 18%, the way you're talking about? Because I'm hearing from districts where
Why?
it's much lower.
And then when this letter goes into effect this year,
You're
some
right.
districts are going to be
And
capped
then
at 10.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
So the
little
numbers down.
background, little research, little might help us out, so we're not so questioning.
Also, and the difference between 18% and your 16 and a third, did you say 16 and a third, somewhere in there?
16 and 2/3.
And 2/3, 16.67. So then so that difference, I wonder if that's the little bit that we were trying to
So
think about.
I think for the sake of time, I'm hearing our marching orders. I want to reflect them back so I'm clear.
Mhm.
So I think there's two parts to a weekly that we want to craft. One part is explaining some background about our reserve, where we're getting the recommended reserve, what some other districts or surrounding districts are seeing, things like that. That's all public information. So
Right.
we can do that. Secondly, I would like to write a little bit about why I'm recommending the solutions as they're listed, so that you have a little further background as to the why and the impact. And then thirdly, I can come back with principles and look at possibly some other options for the board to consider. Again, my goal around this budget study session was to get direction from the board, like you're giving me right now, which is actually perfect, so that we can incorporate agreed upon changes at the first interim. I don't really want to go past first interim, because as we I want these decisions made by first interim, so that I am very clear, and my business services department is very clear, and my HR department is very clear about how I'm going to move forward and what kind of monies we have available to approach staffing and negotiations, both which hit us in the spring. I don't want to go and spend, or I don't want to create programs and plans that eliminate our opportunities around negotiations and staffing. I've already heard even tonight a couple of comments about increased staffing, whether it's at Peninsula or anywhere else. I'm going to need to find funding for that too. So I'd like to get this for lack of a better metaphor, put to bed by December so that we can move on and start discussing staffing and negotiations come springtime. But this
That
is
sounds good.
exactly why we're doing this study session in November, because if you would have given me this direction in April or May, we would not have had enough time to do what President Land, you were asking and the rest of the board is asking. So this is exactly why we're doing it. And I really appreciate the feedback.
No, I think we're right on task, and superintendent and Yancey and the two V squared. Sorry. I think, you know, what we're trying to say is this is exactly what we need to be doing. And it was really great that we did it. And yeah, we're not going to be perfectly on our target, but we're darn close. And really being able to talk to, I really am proud and happy to hear that this is what you guys heard from the principals. This is something that we're adjusting, and it is down on the ground, a good plan. I mean, it goes back to what Bob's saying. It's like, it's you know, well executed. This is what we need kind of thing. So excellent. So again, Yancey, you did a great job presenting to us, and you handled all our questions really well. I know you were under fire a bunch of times, but I'm going to say this was excellent. It really produced what we wanted it to be, you know, and that's what we need. It needs to be a little crispy and crunchy once in a while too, you know.
Absolutely.
It's budget, it's money, you know. All right. Any last comments from anybody?
Comment. I wanted to say that I talked to a few fellow trustees in the county, and they were asking me why we're doing a budget study sessions in November instead of later. I said they thought it was a wonderful idea, and I said it's our superintendent Booker, it's his idea, and this was great to have this discussion early to set us up for future discussions later in a few months. So I want to thank everybody, Yancey and Vanessa and Valerie as well.
I just want to recommend that we start these study sessions, if we're going to do it early, around 4:30, not 4.
Yeah, please.
And that was my own fault when I said it in the agenda and said, oh yeah, sure. I got stuck in an IEP and I couldn't get out. So sorry.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much. That's it. Any last comments?